Police say those two men walked right into the front doors here and lurked in the building for quite some time before seemingly choosing their victim at random, planting a package at his front door, then hiding and waiting to attack.
An attempted murder suspect now behind bars tonight. On Monday evening, officers responded to the 2400 block of Frederick Avenue for a shooting. When they arrived, they found a 19-year-old female and a 23-year-old male had been shot. And after investigating, detectives arrested 60-year-old Ronald Timmons. Timmons has been charged with first and second-degree attempted murder.
Police say new security video shows two robbers bringing a balloon and flowers to a home they tried to rob.
In the South Bronx during the 80s, two brothers, Ronald and Reginald Timmons, became known as the Evil Twins.
It's going to be Ronald and Raymond Timmons, or the newspaper, pretty much as the newspaper called them, the Terrible Timmons Twins.
Their names filled police reports, courtroom records, and neighborhood conversations after a series of violent crimes that left a lasting mark on the community.
This surveillance video catches two men police are searching for in an attempted robbery. You can see them linger outside 1001 Holmes Street just after 7 a.m. on Tuesday.
The most infamous came in 1987 when three people were killed in a Bronx apartment robbery and a young rapper named AZ was left critically wounded. To understand how two brothers reached that point, we have to return to where it all started. Early years. Ronald and Reginald Timmons were born on June 26, 1957 at Harlem Hospital in New York City. Their parents had left Marion, South Carolina, a small rural town where work was mostly in cotton, timber, and tobacco. Like many families moving north in the 50s, they came hoping for a better life. But from the start, things were difficult. Their father was known to drink heavily, and the marriage was unstable. By 1959, their problems had already reached family court, with reports that he had beaten their mother, Carlotta. Eventually, he moved in and out of the home before leaving for good. That left Carlotta with 6 children to raise alone in a 5-room apartment in the South Bronx. The pressure was heavy, and court records later described her as emotionally disturbed. Accounts said she sometimes struck her children with force. Ronald was once seen being thrown to the ground, choked, and stomped. Another son, Barry, was also choked and slammed against a wall. The twins grew up at 1420 Washington Avenue in the Claremont housing projects. The area was dense with families who had been pushed there after fires of evictions from other parts of the Bronx. Claremont itself had a long history, even a park with a pond known as the Black Swamp. But by the 60s, for the people in the towers, daily life was tough. Violence and fear were part of the environment. One neighbor even kept a handgun, baseball bat, and iron rod at home, saying about the Timmons brothers, "If they ever set foot in my place, I'll shoot them dead." By the age of 8, the system had already taken notice. In family court, Carlotta filed a petition to have Ronald and Reginald declared PINs, persons in need of supervision. Raymond was listed as a habitual runaway. Both boys were sent to the Wiltwick School for Boys, a residential facility supported by well-known figures like Eleanor Roosevelt and Harry Belafonte. It was designed to provide guidance, but the other boys there included runaways and offenders with violent backgrounds. As the twins were taken in, their mother reportedly shouted, "They evil. Take them, I don't want them." At Wiltwick, they spent time among troubled peers. Some later committed serious crimes of their own. For Ronald and Reginald, it became part of their childhood story. When they returned home, the situation did not improve. At times, their mother locked them out of the apartment. The twins had to sleep in the stairwells and long hallways of the Claremont projects, sometimes surviving on potato chips and soda. A friend recalled that they often looked at him with his mother and seemed to wonder why they did not have the same care. Their first arrest came on March 13, 1969, when they were just 11 years old, charged with assault and purse snatching. Over the next 4 years, between 1969 and 1973, they were arrested at least 15 times. Each arrest usually meant a stay at the Spofford Juvenile Detention Center in Hunts Point. Spofford had a reputation. Built for children under 15, it was described as overcrowded, run-down, and full of roaches and rats. Almost all of the detainees were Black and Latino kids from poor neighborhoods. Many later said it felt less like rehabilitation and more like punishment. Ronald himself later explained that kids there often picked up ideas from older boys, crimes they hadn't thought of before. In his words, he hears stories, he gets ideas, and he says to himself, "I'm gonna try it when I get older." For the twins, Spofford became another kind of classroom, the streets as home. By their early teens, Ronald and Reginald were moving in and out of Spofford so often that it almost became routine. When they were back in Claremont, the streets felt more like home than their own apartment. In the South Bronx of the late 60s and early 70s, many young people were caught between crumbling schools, unstable family lives, and neighborhoods that seemed abandoned by the city. Fires, poverty, and gangs shaped daily life. For the twins, hanging out in the projects, the stairwells, and the nearby corners gave them a sense of belonging that home could not. Neighbors noticed how quickly they became known. Some said they were smart, always watching, learning how to move in the streets. Others remember them as restless and unpredictable. The twins stood out because they almost always operated together. Wherever one was, the other was close by. It was during these years that their small crimes began to turn into something more serious. Purse snatching, fights, and burglaries became part of their record. The arrests piled up, and so did their time inside Spofford. But with each cycle, they seemed to come back to the projects with sharper instincts. People who grew up around them recall that the streets were like a school of their own. Lessons came not from books, but from watching older hustlers, stick-up crews, and gang leaders. The Bronx was full of names that carried weight, and the twins were listening. They were learning what it meant to survive and what it meant to command respect. The city itself was changing too. The South Bronx was entering its most notorious years, when arson swept through blocks, when whole neighborhoods burned, and when headlines began calling the borough a war zone. For many kids, including the Timmons brothers, the chaos created openings. Where most saw loss, some saw opportunity. By the time they were in their mid-teens, Ronald and Reginald were no longer just two boys in the projects. They were building a reputation, and soon, the street would give them a name that carried far beyond Claremont. Learning the trade. By the mid-70s, the Bronx had become more than just the Timmons brothers' neighborhood. It was their education. With Spofford serving as a revolving door for juvenile offenders and the streets acting as a daily classroom, Ronald and Reginald absorbed lessons that had little to do with school books. In their world, survival meant moving faster than the next kid, striking before you could be struck, and showing no weakness ever. The backdrop to this life was a borough already on edge. Entire blocks were hollowed out by fire and abandonment. Families who could afford to leave had gone, leaving behind crowded tenements, shuttered storefronts, and children with too much time and too little supervision. Against this backdrop, crime became both a threat and, for many, a way of life. A 1976 New York Times report captured just how deep the fear had sunk. The article described how elderly Bronx residents were living in constant anxiety over a wave of push-in robberies. Teenagers were shoving their way into apartments, knocking victims to the ground, and stripping homes of valuables within minutes. One woman was quoted as saying she slept with a knife near her bed. Another admitted she no longer trusted her neighbor's children. Police reported that the suspects were often no older than 14 or 15, boys barely past middle school. These weren't distant headlines for Ronald and Reginald. They were part of the environment that shaped them. The stories mirrored the very streets they walked daily, where stairwells became ambush points and doorways were watched for opportunities. The image of teenagers as predators, not victims, was reinforced with every newspaper clipping and whispered story in a corner store. For the Timmons brothers, growing up in this atmosphere didn't just mean living with fear. It meant learning how fear could be used. Nicknames like Ace and Reggie carried a weight larger than their years because they were spoken in the same breath as the robbers dreaded. In a Bronx already burning, the line between survival and notoriety disappeared. System on trial. As arrests continued, the court system became a constant presence in the lives of Ronald and Reginald. Case files show them appearing repeatedly before family court judges, probation officers, and social workers. Reports describe them as restless and difficult to manage. Judges ordered supervision, counseling, or short stays in juvenile institutions, but each time, new charges followed soon after. For residents in Claremont, this created frustration. Neighbors who had reported robberies and assaults began to feel that legal measures offered little protection. Police records from the late 70s also noted the pattern. Each release was quickly followed by another arrest. The cycle showed no sign of ending. By the late 1970s, the Timmons brothers were no longer just young offenders moving in and out of Spofford. They were young adults carrying the weight of repeated cases that never seemed to stop their path. And in the Bronx, the perception was growing that the system had failed to draw a line. Reign of fear. By the early 80s, the Timmons brothers had become a source of fear across the South Bronx. Police blotters and neighborhood conversations both still pointed to a clear pattern. Elderly residents were their main targets. These victims were often attacked inside their own homes, robbed of small amounts of cash, jewelry, or household goods, but left with lasting scars. Accounts from that period described neighbors double-locking doors, adding bars to windows, and warning one another about answering unexpected knocks. The fear spread beyond the buildings where the robberies happened. In Claremont and nearby blocks, the Timmons name was enough to make older tenants uneasy. Newspapers occasionally carried brief reports of violent break-ins, with details about elderly victims beaten or threatened at gunpoint. Behind those headlines were real people, some too frightened to ever return to their apartments. In one case, a victim described the attackers as calm and coordinated, as though robbery was just routine. Police grew increasingly frustrated. Detectives noted that the brothers often worked quickly, striking and disappearing before backup could arrive. Witnesses were hesitant, sometimes out of fear, other times out of a belief that nothing would come from testifying. The image of the twins hardened during these years. They were no longer viewed simply as young men in trouble with the law. In the eyes of the community, they represented something darker. A pair of brothers who moved together and left behind a trail of shaken residents. And while the robberies defined their reputation, a single night in 1987 would push their names far beyond the South Bronx and into headlines across the city. The 1987 Bronx Robbery. In the summer of 1987, tensions in New York streets were already running high. Ronald Timmons, who had begun using the street name Ace, found himself in the company of Henry Rondu Bolden. Law enforcement records at the time had already linked the Bolden family to robberies and violent disputes across the city. That same year, Rondu's brother was killed, a development that added more weight to the atmosphere surrounding him. On the night of August 21, 1987, Ace, Rondu, and another man identified as Kevin carried out what would be later described as one of the Bronx's most violent robberies. The target was an apartment along the Grand Concourse. Inside the residence were 6 relatives and associates of a young Harlem drug dealer named Anthony A.Z. Cruz, who was just beginning to establish his name in the city's drug game. The men entered, armed and aggressive. Witness accounts later confirmed that the victims were forced to the ground and restrained. Their hands were tied and the intruders moved quickly to strip the room of valuables. What began as a robbery escalated into gunfire. Shots rang out in the apartment, leaving 3 victims dead on the spot. 3 others survived the attack, but not without serious injuries. Among them was a 13-year-old girl who was shot but managed to survive. Anthony A.Z. Cruz, despite being struck multiple times, including a gunshot wound to the head, lived through the ordeal. His survival became a pivotal detail, as it meant there would be direct testimony of what happened inside that Bronx apartment. The case received immediate attention from local newspapers and television. Headlines were focused on both the extreme violence and the remarkable survival of AZ. His recovery in the hospital was followed closely, and when he appeared in court, he became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. From the witness stand, AZ identified Ace, Rondu, and Kevin as the men responsible for the robbery and shootings. The trial that followed was highly charged. Survivors of the robbery sat only a few feet away from the accused, and tensions inside the courtroom was reported as palpable. At times, words were exchanged between both sides, forcing court officers to intervene. Sentencing hearings were equally tense, marked by emotional outbursts from families and heated exchanges that disrupted the proceedings. In the end, Ronald Ace Timmons was sentenced to more than 100 years to life in prison. The weight of the sentence underscored the severity of the crime. His co-defendants also faced lengthy prison terms, although appeals and legal maneuvering continued for years afterward. The 1987 Bronx robbery and shootings left an indelible mark. For law enforcement, it became one of the decade's most notorious cases of drug-related violence. For the streets, it entered local history as the night AZ survived a barrage of bullets and lived to testify, ensuring the names of those involved, Ace, Rondu, and Kevin, would be remembered well beyond the Bronx. Paid in full connection. The 1987 shooting did more than put names in court records. Over time, it became part of hip-hop's cultural memory. AZ, who survived against all odds, later spoke in interviews about that night and the violence that nearly ended his life. His survival shaped both his music and the way people in Harlem and the Bronx remember the story. Years later, when the film Paid in Full was released, the echoes of that night were unmistakable. Though the movie centered on Harlem drug dealers Rich Porter, Alpo, and AZ himself, the robbery sequence drew directly from what happened on the Grand Concourse. The scene of friends tied up, robbed, and shot in an apartment was lifted from real events. For audiences, the connection blurred the line between street history and cinema. What had once been a local tragedy was now dramatized on screen, reaching a wider audience who knew it less as a crime and more as a moment in a cult classic film. In hip-hop circles, the story continued to circulate. The names of the twins, along with Rondu and others involved, were part of conversations about the violence of the 80s drug era. For many, Paid in Full was their introduction, a dramatized version of events that had left deep scars in the Bronx. The Timmons brothers' story, once confined to police files and a neighborhood talk, had become part of a broader cultural narrative that linked the streets of the Bronx to the art and memory of hip-hop. The Fall. After the 1987 trial, the Timmons faced outcomes that finally separated them from the Bronx streets where their reputations had been made. Ronald Ace Timmons received one of the harshest penalties handed down in the borough during that period, a sentence exceeding 100 years to life. For prosecutors, it was a definitive statement that his role in the Grand Concourse murders had ended any possibility of returning to the community. His defense team filed appeals, and in the early 90s, a retrial was briefly ordered, raising questions about whether procedural errors might alter his fate. The proceedings, however, reaffirmed his guilt, and the original sentence remained intact. Reginald's trajectory diverged, but still revealed the same cycle of criminal activity and incarceration. Court and arrest records from the late 80s through the 90s show repeated charges involving robbery and assault. Each release from prison was followed by new incidents, creating a pattern that underscored the difficulty of breaking away from a life rooted in crime. While Ronald's case had effectively closed with a life sentence, Reginald's name continued to appear in police blotters and courtroom filings well into the decade. Ronald's story briefly resurfaced outside New York when investigators in Baltimore connected him to another violent episode. Even far from the Bronx, the same methods and associations seemed to follow him, reinforcing the impression of a man unable to step outside the path set during his youth. By the close of the 1990s, both brothers were firmly locked within the prison system. For Ronald, there was no possibility of release. For Reginald, the repeated arrests ensured that his time outside remained short-lived. What began in the stairwells of Claremont had ended in maximum security facilities, marking the final chapter of their presence on Bronx streets. Legacy and reform. Crimes linked to the Timmons brothers and their associates became part of larger debates in New York about youth and violent crime. During the late 1980s and 1990s, public discussion focused on whether young offenders accused of serious crimes should be tried in adult courts. Lawmakers responded with changes that made it easier for prosecutors to move such cases out of the juvenile system. The Spofford Juvenile Detention Center, where Ronald and Reginald had once been held, remained a focal point in these debates. Long criticized for harsh conditions and poor rehabilitation results, it was officially closed in 2011. Plans to redevelop the site into a community space symbolized a shift away from a facility once associated with confinement. For the families affected by the 1987 robbery and other crimes, the losses were permanent. Survivors such as Anthony A.Z. Cruz carry the events with them, even as they continued their lives. In the Bronx and Harlem, community groups began developing programs that focused on mentorship and alternatives for youth, aiming to prevent similar cycles of crime from repeating.